Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for making some time to be here. I've engaged in this work on 3 different occasions over the last 3 years, and every year it's a very humbling exercise because it's an exercise in remembering. We gather here today to remember, to be reminded that there is still an unacceptably high number of children that are living in poverty in this province. And how is it that we go about remembering? Well, in the case of how First Call leads us, we're led into remembering the facts. We're led into remembering the individual number of children that continue to live in poverty. And so what I thought we could do this morning is collectively participate in remembering. Remembering as many numbers as we can and sharing those numbers with as many people as we know. And so I'd like to invite you to try and remember at least one key fact from the report card this year. It's my invitation to you. And if I can get us started, it would be to remember the absolute number of children that live in poverty. That's all of the children under the age of 17 that live in poverty in BC. And that number is 163,260. So let's think about that. There's 163,260 children that live in poverty. 163,260 children live in poverty in British Columbia. And I invite you to remember that fact, and as you're carrying on with the rest of your day today and you're moving in various circles of work that you engage, stop a colleague, a friend, a family member, and just impart to them that number. Did you know that there is 163,260 children that live in poverty in BC? I think it's a staggering number. It's overwhelming to think that that number represents children. Every one of those numbers represents one child. And when we start thinking along those lines, it should be a little upsetting. We should be moved. And I think each year that I come here, I certainly am. And when I share these facts with folks that I know that don't work with the data quite as closely as I do, they're also moved. Now, when we talk about child poverty in BC, we're talking about a specific measure of poverty. We're using a measure called the low income measure, and it's a statistic that's produced by Statistics Canada. It's based on the tax filer information provided by individuals and families across Canada, and specifically in British Columbia. And every year we are fortunate enough to have access to that information, and we're able to produce it in the form of the report card that we have here, alongside a lot of other very valuable data that speaks to the issue of poverty, including issues of access to food, housing situations, issue of the distribution of income across different cohorts of the population. And when we start looking a little closer at different dimensions of poverty, we can see that it applies troublingly to different segments in different ways. And so we know that there's 163,260 children that live in poverty under the age of 17. When we take a look at how many under the age of 6 there are, we see that there's 53,950. So the youngest children in our midst show up in the poverty rates in unacceptably high numbers. What this means is that there's 1 in 5 children that live in poverty in British Columbia. And BC has the dubious distinction of the 5th highest child poverty rates in Canada. A province as rich as ours should be nowhere near that level of child poverty. The only provinces that have poverty rates higher than ours are Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick. Now, when we think about child poverty, we benefit from thinking about the historical trends. And many of you will be aware that in 1989, on November 24th, the House of Commons passed a resolution to end child poverty by the year 2000. It is the very reason for Campaign 2000, to be bringing forward that leadership declaration year after year to remind Canadians, British Columbians alike, just exactly what the commitment in the past was. And it begs the question, how have we done since then? Well, in 1989, November 24th, that point in time saw a poverty rate in British Columbia of 15.5%. So 15.5% of all children in British Columbia lived in poverty at the time of the declaration. And the view was to introduce measures that would see a continual decrease of child poverty over time until the year 2000 struck and there would be no more poor children living in our country. The opposite has held true. Since that time, child poverty has risen. And at this point in time, we have a full 19.8% of all children in British Columbia living in poverty. The rate has gone up since leadership declared a commitment to decrease it. Now, when we think of poverty, we have to think about the way in which different types of families experience poverty. We know in this province and across Canada that single-parent households experience far higher rates of poverty. It's much, much tougher to be a single parent to make ends meet than it is for couple families. And in the case of single-parent families in British Columbia, we know that 1 in every 2 children in such households will live in poverty. 50% of single-parent households live in poverty in British Columbia. And things are not all that much better for two-parent families with one child. Pardon me. Two-parent families with one child have a similarly difficult go. In fact, over half of poor two-parent families with one child live on less than $18,500 per year. Now think about that, $18,500 per year. That's two parents with one child trying to make ends meet on that income. And I should note that that figure resides 39% below the poverty line. So we set a poverty line for different family compositions. And in the case of a two-parent family household with one child, the poverty line is $30,301. So if there are half of those two-parent families living on less than $18,500, it means that they are living deep in poverty, well below the poverty line. And it is this depth of poverty that characterizes so many of the statistics that we present in the report, that families with children not only struggle to make ends meet, but many of them earn incomes that make it impossible to provide the appropriate supports, services, and care for their children on a day-to-day basis. And we find that completely and wholly unacceptable. That we as a province would allow for that kind of economic situation to be the reality of so many families and children in BC. What this translates into for a lot of families is a remarkable degree of resiliency. The level of care and support that families muster together to make ends meet is nothing short of amazing. The power of love that families show for their children in the face of impossible economic circumstances is nothing short of the best manifestation of determination that I know of. One of the ways in which many households make ends meet in the face of these difficulties is by accessing the supports that communities make available to them. And the food bank is one of the principal sources of support that does exist to provide the necessary nourishment that many households need but don't have the money to afford. In 2016, 33,300 children accessed food banks. 33,300 children accessed food banks in the year 2016. And that is a remarkable and unsettling figure. It's an important service provided in the community, but I think we can all agree that there are more dignified ways of accessing food that we would love to see children participate in. When we think a little bit more about families, it's valuable to think about other modes of support that families living in poverty access. Many families struggling to make ends meet will be receiving income assistance. We know that income assistance rates are wholly inadequate to meet the costs of living in British Columbia. And this has been a long-standing fact for many, many years. Families are left behind to struggle to make ends meet in the face of inadequate support provided by government. A family of 4 receiving income assistance has to get by on $21,924 a year, which is well below the poverty line for that family. I talked earlier about the poverty line for a 2-parent family with 1 child. Well, for a 2-parent family with 2 children, the poverty line is $35,648. That's the cutoff. That's the poverty line. And if income assistance is providing such a family with only $21,924, it means that we as a province, through that type of inadequate transfer, force families into deep poverty every month. And this happens across the province. Every regional district across BC includes reports of very high rates of child poverty and family poverty. In fact, when we take a look at the regional districts, and you'll see that there's some maps in the report and maps online, 22 out of the 29 regional districts in British Columbia have at least 1,000 poor children living in them. So when you look at the map, you can see thousands of children represented in each one of those regional districts who are struggling day in and day out to make ends meet, to afford the basic necessities of life. We also have spent some time in this year's report card looking at the issue of income inequality, the way in which, for some families, things are quite good. The degree to which income is distributed across the different types of families in BC is highly uneven and inequitable. We know that for the richest 10% of BC families with children, that they receive 27% of the total income. So the top 10% get almost 30% of all of the resources. For those children, opportunities abound. Sports programs, arts programs, quality nutrition, excellent before school, after school care, quality transportation, bright future. All of the things one would hope that a child would have the right to exercise their life towards is provided for them. The conditions to exercise their fundamental rights are provided. Well, the poorest half of families share only 25% of all total income. And it's these children who may dream, may hope to provide for themselves in the future the kinds of aspirations, the kinds of education, the kinds of work that they would love to do. The odds are simply stacked against them unfairly, for no other reason than we live in a highly unequal society that is inattentive to the fundamental rights of children to achieve what it is that they seek to achieve. We also know that many children who are in care experience great barriers to accessing the sorts of opportunities that they have every right to access. And for youth that have been in the foster care system under the care of the ministry at some point in time, many of them transition into very challenging circumstances by no fault of their own. The ministry and the government continue to fail children in care. This is a well-documented, well-researched phenomenon, and a deeply troubling one at that. We know that 40% of youth that have experienced homelessness have been in the care of the ministry at some point in time. That exhibits that the quality of care is so poor, so inadequate, so often, that so many of them leave. And they leave for a period of time, we hope, and only a short period of time, we hope, into a state of homelessness. No child should ever have have to experience homelessness. We also know that the transition out of care is wholly inadequate. We know that 50% of youth that age out of care transition into becoming recipients of income assistance. And we know that supports for a positive transition are possible. We have here today folks that will speak to the nature of the kinds of supports and programs and initiatives that would help youth transition out of care into better directions. And we know, having heard from youth themselves, that the solutions are not complicated, that the support that is required is not out of reach, and that solutions are possible, especially when they're centered on the voices of the children themselves and what it is that they seek for their next steps in life. We are gathered here today, as Adrian mentioned, on the unceded ancestral territories of Coast Salish nations, what is currently now called by some Metro Vancouver. And Metro Vancouver has an opportunity to organize itself as a large metropolitan center to convene the resources at its disposal from government, business, and the nonprofit sector, bringing together faith groups and other civil society organizations to be a leading example in Canada and address the fact that we have 82,960 poor children that live in this region alone. We have almost 83,000 poor children that live in this region alone. The vast majority of poor children in British Columbia live here. We also know that among that cohort of poor children, some types of children are disproportionately represented. We know that 33% of all Aboriginal children in Metro Vancouver live in poverty. And therefore the supports for Aboriginal children in particular in Metro Vancouver need to be improved and enhanced immediately, using culturally responsive approaches that are going to honor and respect their unique Indigenous identity. We also know that there's other things that can help. We know that governments make a difference, and that governments are us, the people. We have the capability to drive progressive initiatives forward that address the problem of child poverty. And we've seen other provinces do it. We needn't look too far to the east, only as far as Quebec, to find an example of a government that is taking steps towards addressing the issue of child poverty. We know that if BC had a government transfer effectiveness similar to that of Quebec, we could have helped 42,000 children out of poverty in 2014. Government transfer programs make a positive difference in the lives of poor families. And there is no reason why BC should not be following the leadership of other provinces in this country. What this leaves us with then are questions. If we don't have programs, transfer initiatives that reduce the rates of child poverty in BC, why not? Thank you.